Gideon Harrow didn't knock. He never did. He pushed open the door of the Mercer Ranch office like he owned it, because in every way that mattered, he believed he did. He dropped a leather satchel on the desk, and the sound of it landing was the sound of a man who had never once been told no. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the wood without looking up. "Sign it," he said, "or I take the land Monday morning." Silas Mercer stared at the paper. His jaw tightened. His hands didn't move. Gideon finally looked at him, slow, almost bored, and smiled the way a man smiles when the outcome has never been in doubt. That was the moment Eliza Whitmore walked through the door, and everything Gideon Harrow had spent 18 years building began, quietly, to crack. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next, because the stories here only get more jaw-dropping. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The Matrimonial Bureau's letter had described Silas Mercer in 23 words. Eliza had counted them twice on the train west, partly because she had nothing else to do, and partly because she was the kind of woman who noticed when someone was trying to say as little as possible. Rancher, 41 years old, solvent until recently, honest character, seeks capable woman for practical partnership. No romantic pretense offered or expected. 23 words. And the one that stuck with her wasn't honest or capable or even practical. It was until recently. That phrase was doing a lot of work in a very small space. She'd answered the advertisement not because she was desperate, though her situation in Caldwell, Kansas had reached a point that most people would charitably describe as desperate, but because the blunt language of it appealed to something in her that years of polite society had almost managed to extinguish. No romantic pretense offered or expected. She could work with that. She'd been working around romantic pretense her entire adult life, and it had cost her more than she cared to count. The train pulled into Harlan's Crossing on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and the cold came through the gaps in the car walls like it had a grudge. Eliza stepped onto the platform with one trunk, one leather satchel of her own, and the particular expression of a woman who has already decided that whatever she finds at the end of this journey, she will handle it. The town was smaller than she'd expected. One main street, a feed store, a telegraph office, a saloon that didn't bother to hide what it was, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's financial situation before they knew their name. She was looking for a man matching the description she'd been given. Tall, brown hat, would be driving a buckboard, when she heard two men talking near the livery. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but they weren't trying to be quiet. "Heard Mercer's getting himself a bride," the first man said. He had the voice of someone who found everything slightly amusing. "Won't help him none," the second one said. "Harrow's already got his hook so deep in that ranch, Mercer could marry the governor's daughter, and it wouldn't matter." "What's he waiting for, then? Why not just take it?" "A man like Harrow doesn't take things. He makes you hand them over. More satisfying that way, I expect." Eliza adjusted her grip on her satchel and kept walking. The buckboard was at the far end of the platform, and the man beside it was watching her approach with the careful attention of someone who had been rehearsing what to say and had already decided none of it was right. He was taller than she'd pictured, with the kind of face that had once been open and was now guarded, not from dishonesty, but from disappointment that had come too often to leave room for much else. He took off his hat. "Miss Whitmore." "Mr. Mercer." They looked at each other for a moment with the mutual wariness of two people who have agreed to trust each other and aren't entirely sure why. "I appreciate you making the trip," he said. "You can tell me whether you still appreciate it after we've talked," she said. "I have questions." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, something closer to relief. "So do I," he said. "We can talk on the way out." Doubt. The ranch was 6 miles from town, and by the time they'd covered 2 of them, Eliza had learned 3 things about Silas Mercer that the Matrimonial Bureau hadn't bothered to mention. First, he was not by any reasonable measure a bad manager. The way he talked about the land, The cattle rotations, the timing of the last two harvests. There was nothing careless or ignorant in it. Whatever was wrong with the finances of Birch Hollow Ranch, it wasn't because the man running it didn't know what he was doing. Second, he was angry. Not at her. She was fairly certain of that much. It was the contained, steady anger of a man who had been wronged by someone he couldn't touch, and had been living with that particular frustration long enough that it had become part of the furniture. Third, he was watching to see if she'd flinch. She hadn't decided yet whether that was a test or simply habit. "The Bureau told you the ranch was struggling," he said, when they'd been quiet long enough that the silence started to feel like a question. "It said nearly bankrupt," she said. Those were the exact words. He nodded once, like someone confirming a thing they already knew was coming. "And now that you've seen it," he gestured ahead, where the ranch was just becoming visible against the flat gray sky. Eliza looked at it. The fences were intact. The structures were sound, not new, but maintained. The cattle she could see from the road were not thin. The yard had the organized chaos of a working operation, not the neglected clutter of one falling apart. "It doesn't look nearly bankrupt," she said. "No," he said. "It doesn't." "So tell me what it does look like." He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved through the cold air, their breath visible, steady. "It looks like a trap," he said, "that someone else built, and I'm still standing in the middle of it." They sat at the kitchen table with coffee going cold between them, and Silas Mercer told her the story without dressing it up or apologizing for it, which she appreciated more than he probably knew. 8 years ago, the ranch had hit a genuinely bad stretch. 2 consecutive dry summers, a market collapse on beef prices, and an outbreak among the cattle that had taken 30 head in 1 month. He'd needed capital to survive it, and a man named Gideon Harrow had provided it, quietly, quickly, at what appeared to be reasonable terms. "I read the contract," Silas said. 3 times. Had the banker in town read it too. Nothing jumped out. "What were the terms?" Eliza asked. 15% of annual profits until the loan was repaid, with a final buyout option at the end of 7 years. She set down her coffee cup. "And the loan amount?" $4,200. "What have you paid back so far?" He reached across the table and slid a piece of paper toward her. It was a summary, handwritten, careful, of every payment he'd made over 8 years. She looked at it. Then she looked at it again. Silas. She heard herself use his name for the first time, and neither of them commented on it. "If these numbers are right, you've paid back more than $11,000. "I know." "On a loan of $4,000. "I know." "And the debt is still listed as $6,400. His voice was flat. "According to Harrow's records." The kitchen was very quiet. "I want to see the original contract," Eliza said, "and every payment receipt you have, and the account ledgers going back as far as they go." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You know accounting?" "My father was a bank examiner," she said. "I started reading ledgers before I could properly read novels." "Where are the books?" Plus, he brought her 4 years of ledgers first, the ones he had copies of, and she spread them across the kitchen table and started at the beginning. It took her about 20 minutes to find the first irregularity. It was small, almost insultingly small, a payment of $240 recorded in Silas's copy as applied to principal, but in Harrow's corresponding statement listed as an interest adjustment fee. The difference in how that single transaction was categorized meant that $240 of actual debt reduction had been quietly erased. She set her pencil down. "Come look at this," she said. Silas came around the table and bent over the ledger. She walked him through it. The entry in his copy, the entry in Harrow's statement, the gap between them. "That's not a mistake," he said slowly. "No?" she said. "It's not." "How many times does it happen?" She looked at the stack of ledgers still waiting. "I don't know yet, but I need to find out." She worked through dinner. Silas brought her food she ate without looking up. He sat across from her for a while, watching, not with impatience, but with the focused quiet of a man who had been carrying something alone for too long and was still adjusting to the idea that someone else was in the room. By 9 o'clock, she had found 11 separate instances across 4 years, each one small enough to dismiss as a clerical error. Together, they represented nearly $900 of debt that had been artificially preserved. Payments Silas had made in good faith that had simply been reclassified so they didn't reduce what he owed. "This is methodical," she said. She wasn't talking to him exactly. She was working through it out loud. Someone sat down and thought about this carefully. They knew what they were doing. "Harrow," Silas said, "or someone working for him." She straightened up and pressed her hands against the small of her back. The really frightening part is that it's elegant. You'd never catch it unless you were comparing both sets of records side by side. Even then, each individual instance looks like a rounding error. The banker didn't catch it. The banker was looking at one set of records. I'm looking at both. She turned to face him. "What about the years before these 4? Do you have anything?" "Harrow has the originals." "I have—" He stopped, pushed back from the table. "Wait." He was gone for several minutes. She heard him in another room, moving something heavy. When he came back, he was carrying a battered wooden box with a broken latch, held shut with a piece of rope. "My father kept carbons," he said, "of everything. I thought they were useless." He set the box on the table. "I almost burned them last winter." Eliza looked at the box. Then she looked at him. "Don't ever say that again," she said, and pulled the rope free. "What?" The Carbons went back 6 years before Silas had taken over the ranch, back to his father's time, before Gideon Harrow had appeared on the scene at all, which meant she now had access to a financial picture of Birch Hollow Ranch that was more complete than anything Harrow had likely anticipated anyone possessing. She worked until 2 in the morning. When she finally sat back, she had 4 pages of notes in her own hand and the beginning of something she hadn't expected. Not just evidence of ongoing fraud, but the outline of a system. It wasn't random opportunism. That was the thing that kept her pencil moving even when her eyes were burning. Gideon Harrow hadn't stumbled into an advantageous contract and gradually bent the rules. He'd designed this. The loan terms, the payment structure, the specific categories he'd invented to reclassify legitimate payments, all of it fit together with the kind of coherence that only comes from intention. She thought about the conversation she'd overheard at the livery. Man like Harrow doesn't take things. He makes you hand them over. She understood it now. He didn't need to foreclose. Foreclosure was loud and messy and invited scrutiny. Instead, he had built a machine that would keep Silas Mercer, or any rancher who signed with him, in permanent, invisible debt, paying forever. Never quite catching up. Never quite understanding why. She was still sitting there, staring at her notes, when Silas came back into the kitchen. He'd clearly tried to sleep and failed. "You should rest," he said. "So should you." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. In the lamplight, he looked tired in a way that had less to do with the hour and more to do with years. "How bad is it?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "Tell me what you want. The careful version or the direct one?" "I've been getting the careful version for 8 years from every lawyer and banker I've talked to," he said. "Direct." "All right." She folded her hands on the table. "You've been systematically defrauded. The loan you took out was designed to never be repayable under the terms Harrow controls. Every legitimate payment you've made has been reclassified in his records to preserve the debt balance. If I'm reading this correctly, you now owe, according to his records, more than you borrowed, despite having paid back nearly 3 times the principal." Silas was quiet. "The system is sophisticated enough that it's survived legal scrutiny because no one has ever compared both sets of records simultaneously. You had the carbons in a box you almost burned, and Harrow almost certainly knows they exist and assumed they were too old and disorganized to matter." She paused. "He miscalculated." The clock on the wall ticked. "Can you prove it?" Silas asked. "Not yet. I have the beginning of proof. I need—" She stopped because something had just occurred to her, a thought she hadn't allowed herself to follow until this moment. "Silas, the rancher 2 properties east of you, Patterson, you mentioned him. Has he ever talked to you about his financial situation with Harrow?" Silas's eyes narrowed. Patterson doesn't have an arrangement with Harrow. Are you certain? He's never said, that's not the same thing. She leaned forward. Because the structure I'm looking at, this isn't something you build for one ranch. The setup costs are too high. The design is too careful. This is something you build because you intend to use it more than once. The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Silas put both hands flat on the table. You think there are others, he said. I think there are others, she said. And I think they don't know it either. She slept for 4 hours and woke before dawn with the carbon still spread across the kitchen table and a list of questions in her head that hadn't been there the night before. Silas was already up. He had coffee ready, which she registered as a point in his favor, without comment. Patterson, she said, sitting down and accepting the cup. How long has he owned his place? 12 years, maybe 13? When did he hit his first bad stretch? Silas thought about it. 7, 8 years back. Drought year hit him hard. Lost some stock. He looked at her over his own cup. Same year I went to Harrow. Is he still struggling? Every year he looks like he's about to pull out of it, and then something happens. Silas set down his cup slowly. I always thought it was just bad luck, run of bad seasons, or someone making sure the ledger never comes right, Eliza said. Outside, the wind had picked up. The cold front that had been threatening since she arrived was finally settling in, and she could hear it in the way the house creaked. Not dramatically, just steadily, the way things do when pressure is being applied from a direction you can't see. There's a woman named Hargrove, Silas said. His voice had changed, quieter, like he was working something out while he talked. Widow, took over her husband's ranch 3 years ago when he died. She's been fighting Harrow's men ever since, trying to get a clear accounting of what her husband owed. They keep telling her the numbers are complicated. I imagine they do, Eliza said. And there's a family named Castellano who came up from New Mexico 8 years ago, bought a place on the north end of the valley. They were doing well for a while. Then Harrow extended them what he called a development loan, and after that, he stopped. After that, nothing ever quite added up, Eliza finished. He looked at her. You've never met these people. I don't need to. I know what the numbers look like when someone's running this scheme. Once you know the pattern, you can see it everywhere it's been applied. She pulled her notepad toward her. I need to talk to them. Eliza. He said her name carefully, and she heard something in it that wasn't quite a warning. Harrow is not a patient man when he feels threatened. If you start going to neighboring ranches asking about their finances, he'll hear about it. Within a day, maybe less. She met his eyes. Then we need to move faster than he expects. Silas stared at her for a long moment. Whatever calculation he was running, she watched it happen. The risk weighed against the alternative, which was the thing he'd been living with for 8 years and had apparently decided last winter was no longer bearable. I can get you in front of Patterson by noon, he said. Good, she said. Bring the account ledgers from the last 4 years. I'll bring the carbons. You want to show our hand to Patterson before we know what his looks like. I want him to trust us enough to show his, she said. Sometimes you have to put your cards on the table first. She watched him process that. That's a risk, he said. Everything we're doing is a risk, she said. The alternative is signing whatever Harrow puts in front of you on Monday morning and spending the next 8 years watching him do it again. That landed. She could see it land. All right, he said. Noon. Patterson's ranch was smaller than Birch Hollow, a tight, well-kept operation that showed the same signs she'd learned to read in Silas's place. A man who knew how to work the land, whose trouble wasn't capability, but something external pressing down on everything he built. Carl Patterson met them at the door with the particular wariness of someone who has learned that unexpected visits rarely bring good news. He was a compact man, maybe 50, with the kind of squint that came from years of calculating weather and distance. Mercer, he said. Then his eyes moved to Eliza with honest confusion. This your... My wife, Silas said, which wasn't precisely accurate yet, but Eliza let it stand. She's an accountant. We need to talk to you about Gideon Harrow. Patterson's hand tightened on the doorframe. I don't have any business with Harrow. You took a consolidated loan from him in 1875, Eliza said. I'm guessing it was around $3,000 to $4,000, structured as a percentage of annual profits with a buyout option. Patterson stared at her. And I'm guessing, she continued carefully, that you've been paying it for 8 years and you still can't figure out why the balance never goes down the way it should. The door opened wider. Come in, Carl Patterson said. He put his own ledgers on the table with the resigned expression of a man who had gone over them so many times that he'd lost faith in his own ability to understand them. His wife, a quiet woman named Ruth, who sat to the side and said almost nothing, had the look of someone who'd spent 3 years not sleeping well. Eliza started comparing. It took her 15 minutes to find the first match. Not just a similar pattern, the identical reclassification, the exact same invented fee category, the same terminology, the same percentage applied to reduce the principal impact of every third payment. Someone had used a template, the same template they'd used on Birch Hollow Ranch. Mr. Patterson, she said, in the last 8 years, how much have you paid back on your loan? He looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at the table. Best we can figure, he said slowly, somewhere between $9,000 and $10,000. And what does Harrow's statement say you still owe? $5,200. He said it with the flatness of someone who has repeated a number so often it's stopped meaning anything, which makes no sense whatsoever because I borrowed $3,500. It makes perfect sense, Eliza said, if you understand what he's doing to the numbers. She walked him through it, all of it, the reclassification scheme, the fabricated fee categories, the way each fraudulent entry was small enough to dismiss a loan, but together formed an unmistakable pattern. Ruth Patterson spoke for the first time. You're saying he stole from us? Yes, Eliza said, for 8 years. Yes. Ruth looked at her husband. Something moved between them. Something that had been building for a long time and had just been handed a shape. What do we do? Carl Patterson asked. Eliza took a breath. First, she said, I need to know if you have payment receipts. Everything. Whatever you have. Ruth keeps everything, Carl said, and for the first time something that wasn't exhaustion crossed his face. Every scrap. Ruth was already moving toward a cabinet in the corner. Eliza looked at Silas across the table. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. She was on her third cup of coffee at the Patterson table when Carl said, almost to himself, the widow Hargrove keeps her records in a tin box. She's shown me the statements, said they never made sense. Eliza set down her cup. How far is Hargrove's place? 4 miles north. She looked at the window. The light was already moving toward afternoon, 4 miles out, 4 miles back, and whatever time it took at the other end. We should go today, she said. Eliza, Silas said quietly. I know, we're pushing daylight. It's not just the light. If word gets to Harrow that you've been at 2 neighboring ranches in 1 day, then we get to 3 before word can travel, she said. Carl, she turned to Patterson. The Castellano family on the north end. You know them? Reasonably well. Who else in this valley has had any financial arrangement with Harrow in the last 10 years? Patterson and Ruth looked at each other. That's... Carl started. He stopped, rubbed his jaw. That might be most of the valley, he said. The room got very quiet. Eliza looked at her notes, then at the ledgers spread across 2 tables pushed together, then at Carl Patterson's face and Ruth's, and the very specific quality of the silence that follows when someone finally hears an explanation for something that has been wrong for years. All right, she said. She turned a fresh page. Let's start making a list. The list had 7 names on it by the time the lamp needed trimming. Carl Patterson had started with 3 he was certain about, then added 2 more he was fairly sure about, and then Ruth had come back from the kitchen and added another 2 without being asked, because Ruth had apparently been keeping a mental list of her own for years and simply hadn't had anyone to give it to. Eliza wrote them all down. She wrote the names, the approximate years each family had entered into an arrangement with Gideon Harrow, and whatever Carl and Ruth could recall about the stated loan amounts. She wrote without comment, without reaction, because she'd learned early from her father that the fastest way to stop people from telling you things was to look too interested in what they were saying. When the list was done, she turned the page so Carl could read it. He looked at it for a long moment. "That's most of the East Valley," he said. "How many of those families do you think are still paying?" she asked. Carl looked at Ruth. "Hargrove for certain. Castellano. The Dunbar brothers probably, though I don't know their situation well." He tapped one name near the bottom. "Aldridge sold out 2 years ago. Took almost nothing for the land." "Because he believed he was insolvent," Eliza said. "I suppose so." "He wasn't. He was being made to appear insolvent. There's a difference." She pulled the paper back. "The difference is about $4,000, if what I've seen on your records holds across his." Ruth made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She pressed her lips together and looked at the wall. Silas had been quiet for most of the last hour, watching. She could feel him watching. Not the ledgers, but her. She wasn't sure yet what he was making of what he saw. But he hadn't said stop, and he hadn't said slow down. And in her experience, those were the two things men said when a woman started moving faster than they'd anticipated. "We'll go to Hargrove tomorrow morning," Eliza said. "Carl, would you be willing to come with us?" Patterson blinked. "Me?" "She'll trust this faster if it comes from a neighbor," Eliza said. "And I need her to trust it fast. We don't have the luxury of taking 3 weeks to build confidence." Carl looked at his wife. Ruth gave him the small nod of a woman who had already made up her mind before the question was asked. "All right," he said. "I'll come." The drive back to Birch Hollow was dark and cold and mostly silent. The horses knew the road well enough that Silas didn't have to work at it, and Eliza sat beside him with her notebook in her lap and her mind still running the numbers. "You're doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" "The thing where you're somewhere else." She glanced at him. In the dark, she could only make out the shape of his profile, the set of his jaw, the straightness of his back. "I'm thinking about the filing structure," she said. "If we're going to take this to the Territorial Commerce Commission, we need the documentation organized in a specific way. Not just evidence of what he did to you, evidence of a pattern, repeated, systematic, intentional fraud across multiple properties. That's a different thing than proving he cheated one rancher." "Yes, it is." She paused. "It's also a much harder thing to ignore." He was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this before. Not this situation specifically, but this kind of situation." "My father spent 30 years watching banks fail people," she said. "Half the time the failure wasn't bad luck or bad harvests. It was someone in a back office who understood that small dishonest numbers are almost impossible to prosecute and very easy to hide." She looked out at the dark. "He used to say the most dangerous thieves are the ones who steal in amounts too small to take seriously. Harrow's amounts aren't small. Not in total, but each individual transaction is. That's the design." She turned the notebook over in her hands. "He's been very careful. This is going to take more than careful back." Silas made a sound she was starting to recognize. Not agreement, not disagreement, but the sound of a man turning something over in his mind. "What do you need from me?" he asked. It was a better question than she'd expected. Most men in her experience would have asked what they could do, implying that the doing was theirs to direct. He'd asked what she needed. The distinction was small, but it mattered. "Your carbon's organized by year," she said. "Every payment receipt in chronological order, and access to anyone in this valley you trust who might have interacted with Harrow's financial operation. Clerks, assistants, anyone who might have seen the records from his side." "There was a bookkeeper," Silas said slowly. "Man named Fowler. Worked for Harrow for about 4 years, then left suddenly. Nobody knew why. He's in town now, does work for the feed store. Does Harrow know he's still in the area? I don't know." "Find out," she said. Quietly. She was up at 5 the next morning with the carbons already sorted into 3 years of organized piles on the kitchen table, a system she'd developed while most of Birch Hollow was still dark and still. The coffee was her own making this time. She'd found the tin where Silas kept it, found the pot, found the process without asking, because asking seemed like a waste of time, when the answer was obvious if you just looked. Silas came downstairs at 5:30 and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment looking at the table, which had been transformed overnight into something closer to a command post. You slept, he said. It wasn't a question. 4 hours, she said. I'm fine. You said 4 hours last night. And I was fine then, too. He didn't push it. He got himself coffee and sat at the end of the table that wasn't covered in documents and looked at the organized piles with an expression she was starting to read as cautious hope, the kind of hope that's been burned before and hasn't decided yet whether it's safe to come back. Fowler's name is Edmund Fowler, he said. I thought about it last night. He left Harrow's operation about 2 years ago. Word at the time was some kind of disagreement. Nobody asked too many questions. Where does he live? Room above the feed store. He keeps to himself mostly. Does Harrow's men frequent the feed store? Silas thought about it. Not particularly. Harrow's operation orders supplies through a separate merchant he's got some arrangement with. Good. She pulled a piece of paper toward her. I want to talk to Fowler before we go to Hargrove's. Can you get me to him before 8? Probably, if he's willing to talk. Let me worry about that part. He looked at her over his coffee cup. You're very certain he will be. I'm not certain of anything, she said. But a man who left an employer under difficult circumstances and has spent 2 years keeping quiet usually isn't keeping quiet because he has nothing to say. He's keeping quiet because he hasn't found a reason to talk yet. She set down her pencil. I'm going to give him one. Edmund Fowler was a small man in his mid-40s with the slightly startled look of someone who'd been indoors too long. He opened the door to his room above the feed store in work clothes and stocking feet, clearly not expecting company at 7:45 in the morning, and looked at Silas with the wary recognition of a man who has spent 2 years successfully avoiding something and suspects it has just found him anyway. Mercer, he said. Then he looked at Eliza. Mr. Fowler, she said. My name is Eliza Mercer. I need about 20 minutes of your time, and I want to be straightforward with you about why. He didn't open the door wider, but he didn't close it either. I kept Gideon Harrow's financial records for 4 years, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. And you want to know what I saw? I already know most of what you saw, she said. I've been reconstructing it from the other side for the past 2 days. What I want to know is whether you're willing to tell someone official what you saw. Because what I'm building is a case, Mr. Fowler, and a former bookkeeper with direct knowledge of Harrow's accounting methods would be the difference between a complaint and a prosecution. Edmund Fowler looked at her for a long moment. You know if I do that, he'll come after me. He may try, she said, but a man defending himself from fraud prosecution has limited resources for going after witnesses. And if what I believe is true, that he's run this scheme across most of the East Valley for nearly 2 decades, he's going to have more immediate problems than you. Another silence. Come in, Fowler said, but close the door. Shut. He talked for 40 minutes and she let him, only interrupting when she needed a specific detail confirmed or a term clarified. What he described was almost exactly what she'd inferred from the ledgers, but with the additional dimension of having seen it from inside the operation. Harrow had a second set of records, not hidden exactly, maintained separately, in a different location, with different terminology. The records he showed to ranchers and, if pressed, to lawyers, were real enough on their surface. The records he kept internally tracked the actual state of every account, including the true loan balances that were never disclosed. He called it the working file, Fowler said. Said every complex operation kept a working file distinct from client statements. Made it sound administrative. And the fee categories? Eliza asked. The reclassification of principal payments as interest adjustments? Fowler went still. You know about that. I found it in the Mercer records and in the Patterson records. Same categories, same terminology, same percentage structure. He rubbed the side of his face. He had a name for it. Said it was a liquidity management protocol, like it was a legitimate financial instrument. He paused. I believed him. For the first 2 years, I believed him. It wasn't until I started seeing the full picture, seeing how many ranches he held notes on and what the actual balances looked like versus what the clients were being told, that I understood what I was looking at. Why did you leave? He wanted me to start doing it myself, Fowler said, not just recording it, designing the reclassifications for new accounts. He said it was time I was more involved. He was quiet for a moment. I said I wasn't interested. And he let you go. He didn't have much choice. I hadn't signed anything that made me responsible for what came before, and he couldn't very well put what I knew in front of a judge. Fowler's mouth tightened, but he told me very clearly that talking about what I'd seen would be a significant mistake, that nobody would believe a low-level bookkeeper over a respected businessman, that the records that existed would back him up, not me. He was right, Eliza said. At the time, without the client records to compare to, your testimony would have had limited corroboration. She leaned forward slightly. That's changed. I have the client records. I have 6 sets of them, and I'm adding more. What I don't have is direct testimony from someone who saw both sides of the ledger simultaneously. Fowler looked at his hands on the table. He's moving up his inspection of Silas's ranch, he said. I heard it in town yesterday, someone in the hardware store, talking about Harrow's schedule changing. Eliza felt something sharpen behind her eyes. She kept her face even. When? She asked. End of next week instead of end of the month. Beside her, she felt Silas go still. That's 11 days, he said. 10, she said. She didn't look away from Fowler. Mr. Fowler, I need to know if you'll make a formal statement to the Territorial Commerce Commission. He was quiet for a long time. If I do this, he said carefully, I need to know that the other ranchers are behind it too, not just Mercer. If it's one ranch against Harrow, he'll bury it. By the end of this week, she said, it won't be one ranch. Well, they made it to Hargrove's place by 10. Margaret Hargrove was not what Eliza had expected, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something more fragile, maybe, more diminished. The woman who met them at the door was in her mid-50s, lean and direct-eyed, and clearly accustomed to making every decision on this property herself. She looked at Carl Patterson with recognition, at Silas with cautious familiarity, and at Eliza with the frank assessment of someone who does not have time or energy for people who aren't worth it. Carl said, You've been looking at some numbers, she said. I have, Eliza said. Then come in and show me. Margaret's records were meticulous, even more complete than Patterson's, because her husband had apparently been even more compulsive about documentation, and she'd maintained his system precisely after his death with the focused determination of someone who suspected that the records meant something, even if she couldn't yet determine what. It took Eliza less than 10 minutes to find the pattern. Mrs. Hargrove, she said, your husband's loan. When did he take it out? 1872, 10 years ago. And how much? $3,000. And what does Harrow's office say is outstanding? Margaret's jaw tightened. They told me last spring that my husband had allowed the debt to accumulate through what they called deferred interest obligations, and that the current balance was $4,200. She paused on each word like she'd rehearsed saying it without letting her voice break. I told them that was impossible. They showed me papers. I couldn't argue with the papers because I didn't understand the accounting. She looked at Eliza. Do you? Yes, Eliza said. And I can show you exactly how they did it. She walked Margaret through the identical reclassification scheme she'd found in the Mercer and Patterson records. Margaret followed every word with the tight attention of a woman who had been confused for 3 years and was done being confused. When Eliza finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, He came to the funeral. Eliza waited. My husband's funeral. Gideon Harrow came, stood in the back, told me he was sorry for my loss and that he hoped we could sort out the estate without complication. Her voice was entirely even. I thought he meant well. I thought the complications he was worried about were genuine. He was checking, Eliza said carefully. I know that now. Margaret looked at her records on the table. What do you need from me? Everything you have. Organized if possible, but I'll work with whatever condition it's in. Eliza straightened. And Mrs. Hargrove, I need to know about the other families in this valley you know to have arrangements with Harrow. Not rumors, people you've spoken to directly. Margaret reached into the pocket of her apron and produced a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it on the table. It was a list, 12 names. Eliza looked up from it. I've been keeping this since my husband died, Margaret said simply, because I knew I wasn't the only one. I just didn't know what to do with it. Carl Patterson made a sound under his breath. Silas said nothing, but Eliza felt the shift in the room. The specific quality of the air when several people simultaneously understand that something they thought was isolated is, in fact, enormous. "May I?" Eliza said. Margaret pushed the paper across the table. Cheap. They made 2 more stops before the light failed. The Castellano family, who turned out to have records going back 9 years in a system of meticulous hand-copied ledgers that Rosa Castellano had kept at her kitchen table every Sunday night, without fail. And the Dunbar brothers, who were less organized but more furious, and whose raw anger Eliza mentally filed as potentially useful and presently irrelevant. By the time she and Silas were back at Birch Hollow, she had documentation from 5 families and leads on 7 more. She had Fowler's verbal commitment to testify. She had Margaret Hargrove's list and her own, which now overlapped enough to give her a reasonably complete picture of the scope of what Harrow had built. The kitchen table was no longer enough. She set up the dining room. She worked with the systematic urgency of someone who has discovered that the deadline moved closer and the problem got bigger simultaneously and has decided that the only response to that combination is to go faster. Silas worked beside her, not directing, not second-guessing, sorting, copying, indexing. He had a good memory for detail, she discovered, and a steady hand with figures when she needed him to check her arithmetic. He caught 2 transcription errors she'd made in the late-night hours when her eyes were burning, pointed them out without comment, and moved on. Around midnight, she looked up from the table and found him across from her, looking not at the documents but at the window, where the wind had come back up, and the cold was doing what October cold does when it's decided to be serious. "He's going to know," Silas said. "By tomorrow afternoon, probably. Someone will mention we were at Patterson's place, at Hargrove's. Word moves fast in a valley this size." "I know. And once he knows we're talking to other ranchers, he'll accelerate." "Yes." She set down her pencil. "That's why we need to file before he can act. The moment our documentation reaches the Territorial Commerce Commission, he loses the ability to make this go away quietly. The commission is in Dalton City, 3 days' ride." "I know." "If someone left tomorrow, tonight," she said. "Someone needs to leave tonight, with copies of everything we have so far." She looked at him. "Is there anyone you trust enough to make that ride? Someone Harrow doesn't know well enough to intercept?" Silas thought. "My cousin," he said slowly. "Miles. He's been in Harlan's Crossing for the past 2 weeks visiting his mother. He doesn't have any business with Harrow, and Harrow wouldn't know his face. Can he be trusted to deliver the package without looking at it, talking about it, or stopping anywhere that isn't directly on his route?" "Miles he's a serious man, yes." "Then we need to spend the next 2 hours making copies." She was already pulling paper toward her. "Everything we have documented so far, 2 copies. 1 stays here, 1 goes with Miles." "And if Harrow finds out before the commission acts?" She looked at him steadily. "Then we face whatever he brings. But we face it having already put the documentation somewhere he can't touch it." He looked at her for a moment across the disordered landscape of papers and ledgers that had consumed his dining room. "You've been here 3 days," he said. "I have. And in 3 days you've turned one man's bad contract into a case against the most powerful man in the valley." She picked up her pen. "The case was already there. I just started reading it out loud." He was quiet for a moment. Then he got up and went to the writing desk in the corner and came back with a stack of clean paper. "Tell me what to copy first," he said. Miles Mercer left at 2 a.m. with a canvas satchel under his coat and instructions so specific that Silas had written them down rather than trusting memory. He was a quiet, methodical man who asked no questions beyond the ones necessary, which was exactly what the situation required. Eliza watched him ride out from the porch, the cold coming off the ground in slow ribbons in the dark, and stayed there for a moment after the sound of hooves faded. Silas came out and stood beside her. "Now we wait to see what Harrow does," he said. "Now we keep working," she said. "There are 7 more families on that list." He made a sound that might have been a short, surprised laugh. "You're not going to sleep, are you?" "I'll sleep when the documentation is complete." She turned toward the door. "Come on, I need you to help me cross-reference the Castellano records against what Rosa said about her initial loan terms." He followed her back inside. Behind them, the dark held nothing but wind and distance, and somewhere out in it, a writer carrying the beginning of something that Gideon Harrow didn't know yet was already beyond his reach. But 11 days was not much time, and there were still 7 families left on the list. The 7 remaining families took 3 more days. Not because the families were difficult. Most of them, once Carl Patterson or Margaret Hargrove came with Eliza and vouched for what she was doing, opened their doors with the relieved urgency of people who had been waiting for someone to knock. The difficulty was the records. Some were disorganized, some were incomplete. Some had been partially destroyed by a cellar flood 2 winters back. One family, the Hendrys, had handed over their financial records to Harrow's office years ago, when told that consolidating the paperwork would simplify the accounting, and had received only summaries in return, which Eliza recognized immediately as another layer of the scheme, removing the very evidence that might expose it. She worked around it. She'd learned from her father that incomplete records weren't the same as no records. Every partial ledger, every receipt, every handwritten note about a payment made and received was a data point. Enough data points and the shape of the fraud became visible even where the direct evidence was missing. By Thursday morning, she had documentation covering 11 families in the East Valley. 11 sets of accounts, 11 histories of reclassified payments, 11 versions of the same invented fee structure applied with the precision of a man who had been doing this long enough to stop thinking of it as theft and start thinking of it as business. She sat in the Birch Hollow dining room surrounded by 11 families' financial histories and wrote out the master summary by hand because writing it out forced her to keep the logic tight in a way that simply reading her own notes didn't. The total fraudulent overcharge across all 11 accounts, conservatively estimated, was somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000. She set down her pen, looked at the number, picked the pen back up and checked it again, because numbers that large have a way of making you doubt your own arithmetic. It was right. $60,000 to $70,000 extracted from 11 working families over the better part of 2 decades, through transactions small enough that not one of them had ever been prosecuted, audited, or even seriously questioned. She was still sitting with that number when Silas came in from outside with cold air following him through the door, and the particular look on his face that she'd come to recognize as bad news, he was deciding how to word. "Tell me," she said. "Harrow's man was in town this morning," he said, "asking questions at the general store about you." She kept her expression level. "What kind of questions?" "Where you came from, whether anyone knew your background, whether you'd been seen visiting other ranches." He pulled out a chair and sat down without taking his coat off. The man asking was named Cutter. He works directly for Harrow, not one of the ranch hands, one of his business associates. "What did he find out?" "Whatever the general store owner told him, which is probably enough." Silas looked at the table, at the stacked ledgers, the organized folders she'd made from folded paper, the master summary sitting in the center. "He knows you've been to the neighboring ranches." "I expected that by Tuesday," she said. "We're running a day ahead of my worst estimate." "That's not the part that worries me." She waited. "Cutter also went to the telegraph office," Silas said. "Sent a wire. I don't know to who." That was the part that worried her too. A wire meant Harrow wasn't just gathering information anymore. He was coordinating a response. "How long do we have before he moves up the inspection again?" she asked. "Could be days, could be tomorrow." She looked at the dining room, at the sheer volume of material she'd accumulated, organized, cross-referenced, and which still needed to be prepared in a format that a territorial auditor could follow without her present to explain it. "I need 4 more hours on this," she said. "Eliza, 4 hours? The summary is almost done, but the supporting documentation needs to be indexed. If I hand the commission a stack of papers they can't navigate, the whole thing slows down, and every day it slows down is a day Harrow has to discredit it." She pulled the master summary back toward her. 4 hours. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd seen on him only a few times, something between frustration and something else she hadn't named yet. "I'll make sure nobody comes up the road without warning," he said, and he left her to it. The message came from Miles on Friday, carried back not by Miles himself, but by a rider Miles had paid in Dalton City, a young man who arrived at Birch Hollow in the early afternoon with a sealed note and the air of someone who'd been told to deliver it fast and ask no questions. The note was short. Package received by commission clerk, logged as formal complaint, assigned case number. Reviewing officer is Alderman Price. He says the scope is larger than anything they've seen from this territory. Wants more documentation if you have it. Do not stop. Eliza read it twice and then handed it to Silas without comment. He read it, set it on the table, looked at her. He says, "Don't stop," Silas said. "I haven't stopped," she said. "Eliza." He said it in a way that made her look up from the document she'd already returned to. "This is good news. You're allowed to, I don't know. Take a breath." "When it's done," she said, "not before." He was quiet for a moment. "You're afraid that if you stop, even for an hour, something will slip through." She looked at him. He wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. "The commission needs more," she said. "We have more. Those 3 families we haven't reached yet, the ones on the northern list. If Harrow's scheme was as consistent as everything else shows, their records will add another 20,000 to the total picture." She turned a page. "That's the difference between a serious complaint and an airtight case. The 3 families on the north end barely know us," Silas said. "Reyes, Abbott, and old Tom Glenfield. Tom especially. He doesn't open his door for people he hasn't known for 10 years. Who does he know? Silas thought. Margaret Hargrove. Her husband and Tom went back a long way. Then Margaret comes with us tomorrow. She paused. If she's willing. I think, Silas said carefully, that at this point Margaret Hargrove would ride to the edge of the territory if you asked her. Margaret was at Birch Hollow by 7 the next morning without being fetched, which told Eliza that the news about Harrow's man in town had spread faster than expected. She came in with cold cheeks and a set to her mouth that indicated she'd spent the previous evening making decisions. I heard about Cutter, she said. Sit down, Eliza said. Coffee's on. Margaret sat, looked at the dining room, which by now had the organized intensity of a war room, stacked folders in 11 labeled columns, the master summary pinned to the wall beside a hand-drawn diagram showing the relationships between accounts, and across the back table, 3 copies of every key document in the event that something happened to the originals. You've been busy, Margaret said. We need to reach Glenfield, Eliza said. Margaret nodded once. I figured. I sent word to Tom yesterday, told him to expect us. Eliza looked at her. I said I heard about Cutter, Margaret said simply. I didn't spend all of yesterday evening sitting still, Sim. Tom Glenfield opened his door for Margaret without hesitation and looked at Eliza and Silas with the careful distrust of a man who has been approached by enough strangers bearing bad news that he's stopped pretending to hide the distrust. He was in his late 60s, moving with the deliberate economy of a man whose body had opinions about the cold, and his eyes were sharp in the way that old eyes get when the rest of the machinery slows down and the mind compensates. You're the one that's been going through everybody's books, he said to Eliza, not quite accusing. I have been, she said. And what did you find? The same thing in every set of records I looked at, she said. The same fraud, the same methods, the same fee structures. Gideon Harrow has been systematically extracting money from every family in this valley that he holds a note on, and he's been doing it long enough and carefully enough that until this week, nobody had ever compared records from both sides of his operation at the same time. Tom stared at her. My loan has been paid back, he said slowly. I paid it off in full 4 years ago. Did you get documentation? A letter from Harrow's office saying the loan was satisfied. Do you still have the letter? I keep everything. Then we may still need your records, she said. A fraudulent operation that issued a genuine satisfaction letter is a different piece of information. It tells us something about how and when he decides to conclude an arrangement versus maintain it. Tom was quiet. He had the quality of very old stubbornness. Not the loud kind, but the kind so deeply embedded that it had stopped needing to announce itself. Come in, he said. The Reyes family had records going back 11 years. kept in 3 languages because Elena Reyes had started in Spanish and gradually shifted to English as her children grew into the accounting work beside her. The multilingual ledgers were the most meticulous Eliza had seen. Every transaction recorded twice, once in each language, presumably because Elena had decided that if something was worth writing down, it was worth making sure nobody could claim it was a translation error. Eliza found herself liking Elena Reyes immediately and without reservation, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. The pattern in the Reyes accounts was present but subtler. The reclassification amounts smaller, the intervals more irregular. As if someone had calibrated the scheme slightly differently for this family, perhaps anticipating that the more careful the records, the more careful the fraud needed to be. He adjusted his method for you, Eliza told Elena. Your records were too good for the standard template, so he used smaller amounts at less predictable intervals. Harder to notice as a pattern. Elena looked at her husband, Marco. Something passed between them. I told you the numbers were wrong, Elena said, quietly, without satisfaction. You said they seemed wrong, Marco said, in the tone of a man who has lost an argument he'd been having with himself for years. I said maybe we were miscounting. The numbers were wrong, Elena said again, and returned her attention to Eliza. What do you need? The Abbott family, the last on the list, gave Eliza the final piece she hadn't known she was missing. James Abbott was a terse man in his 40s with 2 older sons who stood in the background of the conversation like large, patient furniture. His records were kept in a battered cash book that had survived a barn fire, missing only its first few pages, which had burned but left the remainder intact. More usefully, James Abbott had made a habit of noting in the margin of his cash book, whenever he made a payment to Harrow's office, exactly who had received it and what they'd said. My father taught me, he said, when Eliza asked about it. He said never hand money to anyone without writing down their face. The marginal notes were a secondary source of documentation that corroborated everything she'd already compiled, and in 3 instances described specific verbal statements made by Harrow's representatives about the loan balance, statements that directly contradicted what the formal records showed. That was new. That was the kind of evidence that didn't just prove accounting fraud, it moved toward intent. She copied the relevant entries with the urgency of someone who has just found the piece that changes what the picture is. They were back at Birch Hollow by late afternoon, and Eliza went directly to the dining room and started integrating the new material into the master case file while the information was still fresh and her cross-references were alive in her memory. Silas brought food at some point. She ate it without looking up. An hour in, she heard horses on the road outside. More than one. Silas appeared in the dining room doorway. Carl Patterson and the Dunbar brothers. And Margaret's here again. He paused. Rosa Castellano. Eliza set down her pen and straightened. Tell them to come in, she said. They came in, all 6 of them, filling the front room with the complicated energy of people who have been separately afraid for a long time, and are only now beginning to understand that they have not, in fact, been afraid alone. Carl Patterson spoke first. Word is Harrow's coming Monday. I know, Eliza said. That's 2 days. I know. The older Dunbar brother. His name was Frank, and he had the build and disposition of a man who had spent years physically preventing things from going wrong through sheer willpower, crossed his arms. Then tell us what we need to do. Eliza looked at the room, at Carl's steady practicality, at Margaret's controlled determination, at Rosa's precise attention, at Frank Dunbar's coiled readiness, at her own dining room, which had become something she hadn't designed for but should perhaps have anticipated, a meeting place. Sit down, she said, all of you. They sat. The ones who couldn't find chairs leaned against the walls. Here's the situation exactly, she said. Copies of everything I've compiled are already with the Territorial Commerce Commission in Dalton City. A reviewing officer named Price has seen the initial package and considers the scope serious. That means we are not operating in isolation. There is already an official record that cannot be destroyed or suppressed. She paused to let that settle. Harrow doesn't know that. He knows I've been visiting neighboring ranches. He may suspect that documentation is being gathered. What he doesn't know is that it's already been filed. She looked around the room. That changes his position significantly. He'll still come Monday, Frank Dunbar said. Yes. And when he comes Monday, I want every one of you to be here. The room shifted. Here, Carl said. At Birch Hollow. If Harrow rides onto this property expecting to find Silas Mercer alone and frightened, and instead finds 11 families who have all compared their records and who all now understand exactly what's been done to them. She stopped. That changes the conversation. He could bring men, Frank said. He probably will. And we won't be fighting, Eliza said. This isn't that kind of confrontation. What we're doing is making it impossible for him to pretend that this is an isolated dispute between him and one rancher. She met Frank's eyes. He will not be able to look at this room and call it a misunderstanding. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. The rest of Monday, Eliza continued, I need one more full day on the documentation. The index needs to be complete, the exhibits need to be numbered, and I need to write a formal summary that a territorial auditor can follow without me present to explain it. She looked at Rosa. I need someone who's good with numbers to check my arithmetic on the master summary. Every figure. I'll do it, Rosa said. I need someone to ride to Fowler at first light tomorrow and tell him Monday is the day, and we need him here. I'll go, Carl said. And I need... She stopped. She'd been about to say she needed someone to go back to the Hendrys and ask if they had anything at all they hadn't already shown her. But she was looking at Silas, who was standing just inside the dining room doorway, and she saw on his face the things she'd been too busy to properly notice for the past 5 days. He was watching her. Not with the wary assessment of a man evaluating a stranger, with something much quieter and more settled than that. What else do you need? He asked. She looked back at the room. That's it, she said. That's what I need. Everyone in this room, here on Monday. Impasse. Saturday was the longest day. Rosa Castellano worked through the master summary arithmetic with the focused intensity of a woman who has been keeping perfect records for 11 years and applies the same standard to everyone else's work. She found 4 transcription errors and 1 calculation mistake in Eliza's figures. All minor, all correctable, each one circled in neat pencil with the correct number written beside it. Thank you, Eliza said when Rosa handed it back. You were working too fast and too tired, Rosa said, without judgment. 4 in the morning arithmetic is not the same as midday arithmetic. I know. These are correct now. Rosa set the document on the table. It's a very clear summary. A person who has never seen a ledger in their life could follow it. That's what I was aiming for. Rosa looked at her steadily. You went to a lot of trouble for people you didn't know 3 weeks ago. Eliza looked at the stack of 11 family ledger copies, organized and indexed, representing years of someone else's careful documentation of a life being slowly emptied. It was already there, she said. I just read it. The day moved in the way that days before something difficult move. Too fast in the hours when there was still so much to do, and then suddenly too slow in the evening when she'd done everything that could be done, and there was nothing left but to wait. She and Silas sat on the porch after the others had gone, the cold coming off the ground in earnest now, the sky doing what late October skies do in this part of the country, vast and dark and indifferent, which she found oddly steadying. Are you scared? He asked. She thought about it honestly. No, I'm tired. That's not the same answer most people would give. I've been scared before. It feels different from this. She looked out at the dark. What I feel now is like when you've been working out a calculation for a long time and you finally see how the numbers resolve. There's something that's almost like peace in that, even if the answer is difficult. He was quiet. What about you? She asked. He considered it. For the first time in 8 years, he said slowly, I feel like Monday is something that happens to Harrow. Not to me. She looked at him. He looked back. That's your doing, he said. Not flattery. Just a fact being stated by a man who had learned late in life to state facts clearly. It's your carbons, she said, and your father's habit of keeping them. The corner of his mouth moved. I'll tell him you said so. You should. They sat in the dark for a little longer, not talking, the cold coming down and neither of them going in yet, which felt like an agreement they'd reached without needing to discuss it. Sunday arrived and left without incident, which made Eliza more alert, not less. Quiet before an expected confrontation was never simply quiet. It was the sound of the other side calculating. She spent Sunday making the third and final copy of the complete documentation, which she sealed in an oilcloth packet and gave to Margaret Hargrove with instructions to take it home and keep it until told otherwise. If something goes wrong Monday, she told Margaret, if Harrow finds a way to delay or discredit what happens here, the commission still has the first package and you have this one. Nothing's going to go wrong Monday, Margaret said. Probably not, but I want 3 copies of the truth in 3 different places anyway. Margaret took the packet with both hands and held it like she knew what it was worth. Sunday night, Eliza sat alone in the dining room after Silas had gone to bed and looked at the complete, organized, indexed, triple-verified documentation of Gideon Harrow's 18 years of methodical theft. 11 families, a minimum of $60,000. 1 bookkeeper who'd seen the inside. 1 former banker's daughter who'd seen both sides simultaneously for the first time in the scheme's history. She thought about the morning Harrow would ride onto this property, expecting the same frightened rancher he'd been walking over for 8 years. She thought about what he would find instead. Then she blew out the lamp and went to bed. She needed to be rested. Tomorrow was going to require everything she had. He came at 10 in the morning. Eliza heard the horses before she saw them. 4 riders coming up the road from town, moving at the unhurried pace of men who have never had reason to hurry because everything has always waited for them. She was standing at the dining room window when they came into view, and she watched Gideon Harrow ride in the way she'd expected. Straight-backed, expensive coat, the particular carriage of a man who considers his own arrival an event. He was younger than she'd imagined. Mid-50s, lean, with a clean-shaved face, and the kind of controlled good looks that photograph well and reveal nothing. He rode a gray horse that cost more than most families in the East Valley made in a year, and he didn't look at the ranch the way a creditor looks at collateral. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he's already decided is his. Behind her, in the front room, 11 families waited. Not all of them had been able to come. The Hendrys had a sick child. James Abbott's youngest son had twisted his ankle badly enough to keep the family home. But 9 families were represented, crowded into Birch Hollow's front room and kitchen in the particular silence of people who have agreed to hold their noise until the moment calls for it. Carl Patterson stood near the door. The Dunbar brothers flanked the fireplace. Rosa Castellano sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and her back straight. Margaret Hargrove had chosen the chair nearest the hallway, from which she could see both the front door and the dining room simultaneously, which struck Eliza as exactly the kind of positioning Margaret would choose. Edmund Fowler stood in the corner near the window, slightly apart from the others, with the look of a man who has made a decision he's not entirely at peace with yet, but has made it anyway. Silas came to stand beside Eliza at the window. 3 men with him, he said quietly. Cutter's one of them. The other 2? Don't recognize them. Probably brought from somewhere else. She watched Harrow dismount in the yard. He handed his reins to one of the men without looking at him and straightened his coat and turned toward the house. He still hadn't looked at anything with the attention of a man who expects to find something unexpected. He thinks this is routine, she said. He does these inspections 4 or 5 times a year, Silas said. He's done dozens of them. They all go the same way. Not this one. She turned from the window. All right. She walked to the front room. 9 families looked at her. He's here, she said. Remember what we discussed. No one speaks unless I ask them to. This is not an argument. Arguments can be confused and discredited. This is a presentation of documentation. Let the papers do the talking. Frank Dunbar looked like this instruction cost him something, but he nodded. The knock on the door, when it came, was not really a knock. It was the knock of a man who considers the gesture a formality. 2 sharp raps, and then the door opening before anyone could answer it. Gideon Harrow stepped into the front room of Birch Hollow Ranch and stopped. The stop was small, barely a half-step hesitation, but Eliza caught it because she was watching for it. He looked at the room, at 9 families crowded into a space built for 1, at faces he recognized and faces he didn't, at the absolute quiet that falls when a large group of people has agreed to be silent simultaneously. His eyes moved to Silas. Mercer, he said. His voice was even, practiced. I wasn't aware this was a social occasion. It isn't, Silas said. Harrow's eyes moved to Eliza. This must be the new wife. he said. Something in his tone placed the word wife in a category that implied it explained everything. The gathered neighbors, the unusual silence, the general inconvenience of his Monday morning. Eliza Mercer, she said. Come through to the dining room, Mr. Harrow. There are things I need to show you. He looked at her for a moment. A professional assessment, brief and thorough. She'd seen that look before. From bankers who'd assumed her father's assistant was decorative. From lawyers who'd watched her do arithmetic and waited for the error. The look of a man calibrating how much attention a woman deserves. He decided on minimal. I'm here to conduct a financial review with the property owner, he said. I don't believe we've been introduced formally enough for... My wife handles the accounts, Silas said. Has since she arrived. The slight pause Harrow allowed himself was very small and very controlled. Very well, he said, in the tone of a man granting a courtesy he finds faintly amusing. Lead the way. The dining room had been arranged the night before with the deliberateness of someone who understands that the physical organization of a space communicates before anyone speaks. One side of the table held Eliza's documentation, the master summary, the indexed case file, the 11 family ledger copies organized in labeled folders, Fowler's written statement, the cross-reference matrix she'd built showing the identical fee structures across all accounts. Everything numbered, everything accessible, nothing buried. The opposite side of the table held 2 chairs, one for Harrow, one for Cutter, who had followed them in with the flat attention of a man whose job is to watch. The other 2 men Harrow had brought were outside. Silas had seen to that with a quiet word to Frank Dunbar, who had gone out the back and reappeared in the yard in a way that made it clear the yard was occupied. Harrow sat. He looked at the table. For the first time, something moved behind his eyes that wasn't performance. This is a great deal of paper, he said. It is, Eliza agreed. She sat across from him. I'll walk you through it. Mrs. Mercer. He said it with patient condescension. I've been managing financial arrangements in this territory for nearly 20 years. I don't need... Mr. Harrow. She said it without raising her voice and without hurrying. I know exactly how long you've been managing financial arrangements in this territory. That's rather the point. She opened the master summary and turned it to face him. This is a consolidated accounting of 11 loan arrangements you hold in the East Valley, cross-referenced against both your payment statements and the original records maintained by the borrowing families. He looked at the document. She watched him look at it. He had a good face for a man in his position, the kind that revealed nothing on purpose. But Eliza had spent the better part of 2 weeks in the company of numbers that told the truth about what this man had built, and she was not reading his expression. She was watching his hands. His right hand, resting on the table edge, went very slightly still. These records, he said. Where did you obtain records from other property owners? The property owners gave them to me. Under what authority? Their own, she said. They're their records. Cutter shifted in his chair. Harrow didn't look at him. I'd like to begin with the Mercer account specifically, Eliza said, since that's what brought you here today. And I'd like to direct your attention to the payment entries on pages 4 and 5 of the summary, cross-referenced with the original receipts behind tab 3. She opened to the pages. She'd marked the key entries with paper tabs the night before. This payment, made in March of 1876, in the amount of $240. She pointed to the entry. In Mr. Mercer's receipt copy, this payment is recorded as applied to principal. In your client's statement for the same period, it appears as an interest adjustment fee. I'd like you to explain that discrepancy. Harrow looked at the entry. Accounting adjustments of that nature are standard, he said. The contract allows for... The contract, Eliza said, is behind tab 1. I've read it. There is no provision in the contract for reclassifying principal payments as interest adjustment fees. The contract specifies that payments in excess of the monthly interest obligation reduce the outstanding principal balance. She kept her finger on the entry. This payment was in excess of the monthly interest obligation by $140. That $140 should have reduced the principal. It did not. I'd like to know why. Silence. Cutter was looking at Harrow now. Administrative error, Harrow said. It occurs 11 times in the Mercer account alone, Eliza said. The same error, the same category, the same reclassification. 11 times across 8 years. She turned to the next marked page. It occurs in the Patterson account 7 times. In the Hargrove account 9 times. In the Castellano account 14 times, with a slightly modified fee category that appears to have been calibrated to the quality of Mrs. Castellano's record keeping. She looked up from the documents. Administrative error doesn't show up 14 times in one account with a modified methodology. Harrow said nothing. She turned to the cross-reference matrix. I've mapped the fee categories across all 11 accounts, she said. The terminology is identical. The percentage structure is identical. The intervals, while varied, follow a consistent mathematical relationship to the payment schedule in each contract. She turned the matrix to face him. This is a system. It was designed, and it has been applied to every loan arrangement you hold in this valley. The room was very quiet. Cutter's hand moved toward his coat, and then stopped, because Frank Dunbar had appeared in the dining room doorway with his arms crossed, and his expression communicating, without words, that whatever Cutter was thinking about doing would be a significant mistake. Harrow looked at the matrix. Then he looked at Eliza. For the first time, the performance in his face was incomplete. She could see the calculation running, not the confident calculation of a man managing a routine situation, but the urgent recalculation of a man who has walked into a room that is not the room he expected. You're very thorough, he said. His voice was still controlled, but something had shifted in it. A flatness where the condescension had been. I was raised to be, she said. These are... He stopped, chose different words. These records would need to be independently verified. Any claim of irregularity based on documents assembled by the families who kept them, she said. Yes, they'll need to be verified. She reached to the back of the document stack and produced a single sheet. This is a case number assigned by the Territorial Commerce Commission in Dalton City. A copy of this documentation was filed with the Commission 11 days ago. The reviewing officer is Alderman Price. His office has already confirmed receipt and begun preliminary review. She set the paper on the table in front of him. The verification process you're suggesting has already been initiated. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Harrow looked at the case number. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up. And the thing that had been behind his eyes the whole time, the absolute confidence of a man who has never been in a room where the exits weren't his, was not entirely there anymore. You filed with the commission, he said, 11 days ago, before this meeting. 8 days before I knew you'd moved your inspection forward, yes. He was quiet. Cutter leaned toward him and said something in a low voice. Harrow didn't respond. He was looking at the documentation on the table with the attention he hadn't brought when he walked in. The real attention, the kind that strips away performance because performance has stopped being useful. The Fowler statement, he said suddenly. Not a question. He'd found the tab label on the organized stack. Edmund Fowler was employed in your accounting operation for 4 years, Eliza said. He has provided a written statement describing the internal record-keeping practices of your office, including the maintenance of a secondary ledger system distinct from the client statements you provided to borrowers. She paused. He's prepared to repeat that statement before the commission, if asked. Harrow pushed back from the table. Not standing, just creating distance between himself and the documents, as if distance helped. This is... He stopped again. Take your time, she said. He looked at her with something that was not quite anger and not quite respect, and was some uncomfortable combination of both. What exactly is it that you want, Mrs. Mercer? I don't want anything, she said. The commission wants an audit. The families in the next room want a clear accounting of what they've actually paid and what they actually owe. What happens after that audit is the commission's business, not mine. She met his eyes. But if you're asking what would have prevented this, the answer is accurate accounting. That's all it would have taken. He stood up. This meeting is over, he said. Yes, she agreed. I think it is. He straightened his coat. He picked up nothing from the table because there was nothing on the table that belonged to him. He moved toward the door and stopped because Carl Patterson was standing in the hallway with the particular stillness of a man who is not blocking anything, technically, but whose presence communicates that passage requires acknowledgement. They looked at each other. "Carl," Harrow said, with the forced familiarity of a man buying time. "Gideon," Carl said, and said nothing else. Harrow moved past him. In the front room, 9 families watched him cross toward the door. He didn't look at them, or he tried not to, but the attempt was visible, which was worse than simply looking. He kept his eyes forward and his walk measured, and he pushed through the front door and out into the yard where his men were waiting. The room was quiet until the sound of horses faded. Then Frank Dunbar exhaled a sound that was not a word but communicated the release of significant pressure, and Rosa Castellano said something in Spanish under her breath that her eldest son immediately translated for the room as roughly equivalent to "about time," and Carl Patterson sat down heavily in the nearest chair and rubbed his face with both hands. Silas stood in the dining room doorway. He looked at Eliza. She looked back at him. "He'll try something," he said quietly. "He'll try," she agreed. "He has fewer options than he did an hour ago, but yes." "What do we do now?" "We wait for the commission," she said, "and we stay visible. All of us." She looked at the room, at the 9 families, at Fowler still standing in the corner with his arms crossed and his jaw set. No one disappears, no one stops talking to their neighbors, no one pretends this morning didn't happen. "If Harrow tries to approach any of you privately, he won't find us alone," Margaret said from her chair by the hallway. "That's exactly right," Eliza said. "Ooh." The days that followed were not quiet, but they were a different kind of loud than the days before. The loud of things moving rather than threatening to fall. Word spread through the valley the way word does. Imperfectly, with embellishments, with the specific warping that happens when a story passes through enough mouths. By Tuesday, the story going around Harlan's Crossing was that Silas Mercer's new wife had somehow obtained Gideon Harrow's private records and confronted him with them in front of half the valley. By Wednesday, the account had grown to include Fowler producing documents from inside his coat and the Dunbar brothers physically preventing Harrow's men from interfering. By Thursday, versions existed in which Harrow had actually signed something. None of it was accurate. All of it was, in its garbled way, trying to describe something real. Eliza didn't correct the stories. She was busy. The commission sent a writer with a formal request for additional documentation on the 14th day. Specific exhibits, numbered as she'd numbered them, which told her that Alderman Price had gone through the first package carefully enough to know exactly what he wanted more of. She assembled the requested materials with Rosa Castellano's help, because Rosa had taken it upon herself to become the unofficial second pair of eyes on anything mathematical, which Eliza had stopped protesting after the 4th transcription error Rosa caught. "You don't have to keep doing this," Eliza told her. "I know," Rosa said, and kept doing it. The response to the commission's supplemental package came 3 weeks later, by which time October had given way to November, and the cold had stopped being a threat and become simply the conditions under which everything continued to happen. The response was formal, measured, and definitive. Alderman Price wrote that the Territorial Commerce Commission had completed a preliminary review of the submitted documentation and had determined sufficient grounds to open a formal investigation into the financial practices of Gideon Harrow and associates operating in the East Valley Territory. Independent auditors would be dispatched within 30 days. All loan agreements held by Harrow in the affected territory would be frozen pending audit. No foreclosure, collection action, or contract enforcement could proceed until the investigation concluded. Eliza read the letter at the kitchen table with Silas standing behind her, reading over her shoulder. "Frozen," he said. "All of them. No collection, no enforcement. He can't take the ranch. Not during the investigation, and if the audit finds what I expect it to find," she set the letter down, "he won't be taking anything from anyone in this valley for a long time." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I want to show this to Carl," he said, "and Margaret and the others. We should get everyone together," she said, "same as before." She paused. "They deserve to hear it at the same time, not secondhand." He nodded. He was already reaching for his coat. "Silas." He stopped. She looked at the letter on the table. Send word to Edmund Fowler first. He took the biggest risk. He looked at her. Of course, he said, and went. They gathered at Birch Hollow again 2 days later, because getting 11 families to the same place on the same day required 2 days of coordinating, and because Eliza had spent those 2 days making sure every family had a copy of the commission letter and understood exactly what it meant in practical terms before they heard it in a room together. Margaret Hargrove cried. Only briefly, and she looked annoyed at herself for it, but she cried. Ruth Patterson held her hand, which Margaret allowed for approximately 40 seconds before straightening up and asking a precise question about the timeline of the audit. The Dunbar brothers didn't say much. Frank shook Silas's hand and then, after a moment's consideration, shook Eliza's hand too, with the gravity of someone making a formal acknowledgement. Edmund Fowler sat in the corner where he always sat, and when Eliza caught his eye across the room, he gave her a small, contained nod that communicated more than most speeches could have. Rosa Castellano's eldest son translated the letter for his grandmother, who had come this time, and who listened with the patient attention of a woman who has lived long enough to know that good news requires the same respect as bad. When he finished, she said something in Spanish, and Rosa laughed. The first time Eliza had heard Rosa laugh, and it was a good sound, genuine and surprised. "What did she say?" Eliza asked. Rosa shook her head, still smiling. She said it was about time someone counted properly. The room had the quality of the end of a long-held breath. Not celebration exactly, because the audit hadn't concluded and the frozen loans hadn't been resolved, and there was still considerable unknown territory between here and a final outcome. But the specific grinding fear that had shaped these families' lives for years, the fear that came from owing more than you could calculate to a man who controlled the calculation, that fear had changed shape. It had a case number now. It had an auditor's name. It had become the kind of problem that has a process, which is a very different thing from the kind that has no solution. Carl Patterson said, at some point in the middle of the evening when most of the coffee was gone and the room had relaxed into something that was almost ordinary, "What I still can't understand is how nobody caught this before." The room was quiet in a way that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite argument. "You caught parts of it," Eliza said. "Every one of you noticed something wrong. You brought it to lawyers and bankers, and they looked at one set of records and told you the numbers added up. They weren't lying. They were looking at the wrong thing." She looked around the room. The only way to see it was to compare both sides simultaneously. And no one had reason to do that because no one knew there were two sides. "You knew," Carl said. "I suspected," she said, "because I'd seen the pattern before, in different forms. That's not cleverness. That's having been in the room when my father explained it 20 years ago about something completely different." She shook her head. "You're not foolish for not catching it. You were specifically prevented from catching it. There's a difference." Ruth Patterson, who had said very little all evening, spoke up from the far end of the room. "What happens to the money?" she asked. "The money we've overpaid. If the audit proves what you've shown, do we see it again?" The room shifted attention. It was the question everyone had been not quite asking. "I don't know," Eliza said. "The Commission has enforcement authority, but recovery of fraudulently extracted funds depends on what Harrow has and what the courts decide. I won't tell you everyone gets back exactly what was taken, because I don't know that." She paused. "What I can tell you is that the fraudulent debt is almost certainly void, which means what you owe going forward is what you actually owe, not what he says you owe. That's the difference between a number that grows forever and one that can be paid off and finished." Ruth nodded slowly. She looked at Carl. He looked back at her with the expression of two people doing the same silent arithmetic. "That's enough," she said quietly. Not to the room. To herself and Carl. "That's enough to work with." The auditors arrived on a Thursday in early December, 3 men from the commission office with a sealed appointment letter and a list of documents they expected to find ready. They were. Eliza handed them the indexed case file, the master summary, the 11 family documentation packages, and Fowler's formal statement, all organized precisely as Alderman Price's request had specified, because she'd been updating and refining the filing for the 3 weeks since the freeze had been announced. The lead auditor, a compact man named Garrison, who wore glasses and had the slightly harassed air of someone perpetually behind on a workload, went through the index with his finger moving down each entry. He looked up at her. You prepared this yourself? Yes. You have a legal background? No, my father was a bank examiner. He looked back at the index. This is more organized than most things we receive from practicing attorneys. He said it without much expression, which she took as the highest form of compliment available from a man of his temperament. The cross-reference matrix is on page 47, she said. It's the fastest way to see the pattern across all accounts simultaneously. He turned to page 47. His expression didn't change, but he spent a long time on that page. We'll need to speak with the property owners individually, he said. I've arranged for them to be available at whatever schedule suits your office, she said, and Edmund Fowler, who provided the bookkeeper's testimony, is in town and can come to you. Garrison looked at his two colleagues. We may be here longer than the standard window, he said to them. I expected as much, the younger of the two said, which was the first thing he'd said since they arrived. Garrison turned back to Eliza. Mrs. Mercer, I've been doing this work for 19 years. I want to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Did you have any assistance preparing this documentation? Legal counsel, financial advisor, anyone with formal training? She looked at him steadily. Rosa Castellano checked my arithmetic. He stared at her. Rosa Castellano is a rancher's wife with 11 years of careful bookkeeping experience, Eliza said. She found 4 transcription errors and 1 calculation mistake in my summary. You'll want to know her if you haven't already. Her own records are the most complete in the valley. Garrison put the index down on the table. All right, he said, in the voice of a man recalibrating. Let's begin. Garrison and his team stayed for 11 days. They worked out of Birch Hollow's dining room, which had by now hosted enough consequential conversations that the furniture had developed permanent associations Eliza suspected would outlast the documents themselves. Garrison was methodical in the way that people who have been doing precise work for a long time become methodical, not slow, but thorough, in a way that looked slow to anyone watching who didn't understand what thorough actually required. He interviewed each family separately, 1 per day, in a sequence he determined from the documentation and refused to explain. He asked questions that were specific and technical, and he did not react visibly to the answers, which Eliza recognized as professional discipline of the same kind she tried to maintain and didn't always succeed at. On the 4th day, he interviewed Edmund Fowler for 3 hours. Eliza didn't ask what was said. Fowler came out of the dining room afterward, looking wrung out and quieter than usual, and he sat on the porch for a long time without talking to anyone, and she brought him coffee and left him alone with it, because some processes require space that conversation fills badly. On the 7th day, Garrison asked to speak with her. She sat across from him in the same chair she'd occupied when Harrow sat on the opposite side, which she noticed with a private sense of the absurd. This table had seen more decisive conversations in the past 6 weeks than it probably had in the entire previous decade. I want to ask you something that isn't part of the formal audit, Garrison said. He'd taken off his glasses and was holding them by one arm in the way people do when they're about to say something they want to look directly at you for. All right, she said. When you arrived here, when you first opened those ledgers, did you know what you were looking for? She thought about how to answer that honestly. I knew something was wrong. The ranch didn't match what I'd been told about it. When the numbers don't match the visible reality, there's usually a reason. But the specific scheme, the reclassification method. I recognized the structure within the first hour, she said. My father encountered a version of it once in a banking context. Different terminology, same principle. Take a legitimate transaction and reclassify it in a way that changes what it does to the balance, then rely on the complexity to prevent the borrower from noticing. Garrison was quiet for a moment. In 19 years, he said, I have not seen this level of documentation assembled without legal counsel, without formal training, and he checked something in his notes. 11 days of active collection. 13, she said. I started before I fully understood what I had. 13 days. He put his glasses back on. I want you to understand something, Mrs. Mercer. What the audit confirms and what the Commission's enforcement process produces are 2 different things. The audit will confirm the fraud. I can tell you that much, because what you've given me is not ambiguous. What happens after confirmation involves lawyers and courts and processes that take time. I understand that. The families may not recover everything. I've told them that. He looked at her steadily. You told them in a way they understood and accepted? I told them in a way that was true, she said. What they do with true information is their own business. What? Something moved in Garrison's expression. Something that wasn't quite a smile but occupied the same territory. The commission will want to correspond with you directly during the enforcement phase, he said. If you're willing. I'm willing, she said. Well, Garrison's team left on a Thursday with 2 full trunks of documentation copies and a formal receipt that listed every exhibit by number. The lead auditor shook Silas's hand at the door and then turned to Eliza and shook her hand with the same deliberate formality, which she understood was a statement of a particular kind. You'll hear from Price's office within 30 days, he said. Thank you, she said. He nodded once, put on his hat, and was gone. The house felt different after they left. Not empty. She and Silas were still in it, and the dining room still held the ghost organization of 6 weeks of intensive work, but different in the way that rooms feel different after the purpose that filled them has moved on. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and didn't do anything for a while, which was unusual enough that Silas noticed and didn't comment on it, which was the right response. After a while, he sat down across from her. You should sleep, he said. I slept last night. More than 4 hours? She considered lying and decided against it. Probably not. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know as his version of concern. Not hovering, not instructing, just present and honest about what he was seeing. It's done, he said. The part that needed you to run it, it's done. The enforcement isn't done. But that part isn't yours to carry the same way. She looked at her coffee cup. He wasn't wrong. And she knew he wasn't wrong, and knowing it and being able to act on it were 2 different things. She'd been moving at speed for 6 weeks, and the speed had its own momentum, and stopping was not as simple as deciding to stop. Tell me something, she said. What? When you wrote to the matrimonial bureau, what did you say about yourself? He was quiet for a moment. Honest character, he said, seeks capable woman for practical partnership. You didn't say you needed someone to investigate financial fraud. I didn't know that's what I needed. A pause. I knew I needed someone who wouldn't flinch. I'd been around enough people who flinched. She looked at him. Did you expect to find what you found? She asked. Not about the fraud. He understood what she was asking. No, he said. I expected someone capable, someone practical. I didn't expect someone who would look at my problem and make it bigger before she made it smaller. Is that a complaint? It's an observation. The corner of his mouth moved. I liked it. She felt something settle in her chest that had been held at a slight tension for weeks. Not the completion of a calculation, something less precise and more durable than that. I should write to my things in Caldwell, she said. My remaining things. Have them sent here. He looked at her carefully. You're staying, he said. Not a question, but checking. I came here to stay, she said. That hasn't changed. Even with... He gestured vaguely at the dining room, at the weeks of complexity it represented. Especially because of, she said, but the commission's formal findings arrived in the 3rd week of January, when the snow had settled into the permanent kind that doesn't apologize for itself. The document ran to 14 pages. Eliza read all 14 on the morning it arrived before she told anyone else it had come, not because she wanted to keep it from them, but because she needed to understand every word of it herself first so that she could explain it accurately to the people it affected. What it said, stripped of the formal language and the procedural qualifications, was this. The Territorial Commerce Commission had confirmed systematic fraudulent accounting practices across all 11 accounts reviewed. The specific reclassification method documented in the submitted case file had been in use for a minimum of 16 years. The Commission's independent audit had located evidence predating even the oldest records Eliza had collected. The total confirmed fraudulent overcharge across all accounts was $63,412. All existing loan agreements were declared void and unenforceable. A referral had been made to the Territorial Attorney General's Office for criminal proceedings. Gideon Harrow's financial operating license in the territory had been suspended pending resolution of criminal proceedings. She sat with the document for a long time. $63,000. 16 years. Not 2 decades of bad luck distributed across the East Valley. One man's deliberate architecture, built so carefully that it had survived lawyers and bankers and court filings, and the general scrutiny that gets applied to things that look almost right. Until someone compared both sides of the ledger at the same time. She folded the document along its original creases and went to find Silas. They gathered one more time at Birch Hollow on a Saturday in late January. The snow made the roads difficult, and 2 families sent word they couldn't come. The Hendrys were snowed in, and one of the Dunbar brothers had taken ill. But 9 families made it, some of them traveling through conditions that testified to how much this particular gathering meant. Eliza read the relevant sections aloud slowly, because some information deserves to be spoken rather than summarized. When she finished, the room was quiet in the specific way that groups of people go quiet when they've been waiting a long time for something and it has finally arrived, and the arrival is both better and less simple than the waiting had imagined. Carl Patterson had his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, not crying, just holding himself still. Ruth Patterson put her hand on his back. Margaret Hargrove sat very straight and looked at the wall with the particular expression of a woman communicating something to someone who wasn't in the room, her husband. 3 years of confusion resolved into a single 14-page document that said, "You were right. It wasn't you. The numbers were wrong on purpose." Rosa Castellano translated for her mother-in-law, sentence by sentence. The old woman listened without expression until Rosa finished, and then she said something in Spanish. "What did she say?" Eliza asked. Rosa's voice was slightly unsteady. She said that her husband worked this land for 30 years and never once understood why the numbers never came right. And now she does. And she wishes he could have known. The room absorbed that. Frank Dunbar cleared his throat. His younger brother looked at the floor. Edmund Fowler, in his usual corner, said nothing. But he'd come, which Eliza thought said everything that needed saying. "The void contracts," Carl finally said, lifting his face from his hands. "What does that mean for the debt, right now, today?" "It means you don't owe it," Eliza said. "The Commission's finding is that the agreements were fraudulent from their structure. The underlying loan amounts, what you actually borrowed, those are a separate matter that the Attorney General's process may address. But the inflated, manipulated balances that Harrow claimed you owed, those are gone. And recovery of what we paid over? I won't promise you a number," she said. "The criminal proceedings will determine what assets can be recovered and how they're distributed. It's possible some recovery happens. It's possible the amount is partial. What I can tell you is that the Commission's document is the foundation for it, and it's a solid foundation." Carl nodded slowly. "It's enough," Ruth said, the same words she'd used months ago, and she meant the same thing. Not that everything was resolved, but that there was enough solid ground to stand on and move from. Margaret spoke up. "What about Harrow himself? Where is he?" "Dalton City, as far as anyone knows," Silas said. "The suspension of his operating license was effective immediately. He can't do business in this territory while the criminal proceedings are pending." "Can he run?" Frank Dunbar asked. "He can try," Eliza said. "The referral to the Attorney General creates an official record that travels with him. It's harder to disappear from a formal criminal referral than from an unhappy client." Frank nodded, with the expression of a man who had wanted a different answer and was making his peace with the one that existed. After the others left, Eliza and Silas sat at the kitchen table in the particular quiet of a house that is just emptied of people and hasn't decided yet whether to go back to being ordinary. "Margaret asked me something before she left," Silas said. "What?" "She asked if you were planning to do this professionally." He looked at her. Her exact words were, "Is your wife available for hire, or is she exclusive to lost causes in this valley?" Eliza looked at him. "What did you tell her?" "I said I didn't speak for you." She was quiet for a moment, turning the question over. It hadn't occurred to her in those terms, not as a profession, as a thing she could offer deliberately rather than stumbling into through circumstance. But as she turned it over, she found it wasn't as strange as it should have been. She had done, in 6 weeks of cold and bad coffee and nights that ran too late, something she was genuinely suited for. Not because it had been smooth or easy, it had been neither. But because the particular combination of skills it required happened to be the combination she had, and those skills had been going mostly to waste for the better part of her adult life. "Tell Margaret I'll talk to her," she said. Silas looked at her with the careful attention that she'd come to associate with his best quality, the ability to pay attention to things without immediately having an opinion about them. "It would mean travel," she said. "Probably significant travel if other cases develop. I don't know yet what it would look like." "I know." "You'd be managing the ranch through it." "I've been managing the ranch," he said. "I'm fairly good at it when someone isn't systematically stealing from me." She looked at him. "I'm not asking your permission," she said. "I'm telling you what it would mean practically." "I know you're not asking permission," he said, without offense. "I'm telling you it's fine. Because it is." He paused. "This ranch is not a cage, Eliza. I didn't write to the bureau looking for someone to lock down." She thought about the letter. 23 words. No romantic pretense offered or expected. She'd read it as a warning, as a man managing expectations downward. She understood now that it had been something else, a man describing honestly what he had and what he needed, without dressing it up into something it wasn't. "We should probably have an actual wedding," she said. Something shifted in his face. "We should." "Nothing elaborate. I have no patience for elaborate. There's a justice of the peace in town who's done it in under 10 minutes. "That'll do," she said. He almost smiled. "Most women would want more than 10 minutes. "Most women weren't practical partnerships to begin with," she said. "We've had 6 weeks of crisis. 10 minutes of legal formality seems proportionate." Sod. The wedding was on a Tuesday in February, with Carl and Ruth Patterson as witnesses and Margaret Hargrove present because she'd heard about it and shown up, which Eliza decided afterward was exactly right. The justice of the peace took 9 minutes. Ruth cried briefly and apologized for it. Carl shook Silas's hand twice, seemingly because once didn't feel like enough. Margaret brought a bottle of something she referred to only as very good and very old and refused to specify further. They drank it at Birch Hollow's kitchen table and the conversation went everywhere. The audit, the criminal proceedings, the spring planting, a persistent problem with Carl's north fence line, whether the valley's cattle prices would recover before summer. Normal things, complicated things. The ordinary mixture that fills a life when the emergency that was consuming it has finally, definitively moved on to become someone else's problem to resolve. Eliza sat in the middle of it and felt the specific quality of a thing that is not happiness exactly, but contains happiness as one of several ingredients, something more durable than a single feeling, built out of the knowledge that she was in the right place doing work that mattered alongside people who deserved the outcome they'd fought for. She had not expected that when she stepped off the train in Harlan's Crossing with one trunk and the particular expression of a woman braced for difficulty. She had expected difficulty. She had not expected this. Spring came late that year, the way spring comes when winter has made up its mind to stay. But it came. The Attorney General's proceedings against Gideon Harrow moved through their proper legal channels with the weight of the Commission's findings behind them. The criminal case was not fast. These things are never fast. But it was solid in the way that cases built on documented evidence and corroborating testimony tend to be solid. Word reached the Valley in April that Harrow had attempted to engage 3 separate law firms in Dalton City and been declined by 2 of them, which was information that traveled through Harlan's Crossing with a particular velocity. The frozen loan balances were formally voided by court order in March. The process of determining what recovery, if any, the affected families could expect from Harrow's assets took considerably longer and produced results that were partial and imperfect, as Eliza had warned they would be. The Castellano family recovered roughly 40% of their confirmed overpayment, the Pattersons slightly less. Margaret Hargrove received a settlement figure that she described as not nothing, which, given where she'd been 3 years earlier, she accepted with the clear-eyed pragmatism of a woman who knows the difference between justice and satisfaction and doesn't confuse them. Nobody got back everything, but nobody owed the impossible number anymore either. The debt that had been designed to never be payable was gone, and what remained was real. Real amounts owed, real land owned, real calculations that came out the same way every time because no one was adjusting them in a back office. That turned out to matter more than the recovery and the daily experience of it. Eliza heard this from Margaret first, then from Rosa, then from Ruth Patterson in a letter that arrived in April and took 2 careful pages to say something that eventually simplified to, "I slept last night without dreaming about the numbers." Eliza kept that letter. Right there. The bookkeeping office opened in May. It was Margaret's idea and Eliza's implementation, which seemed like the right division of labor between 2 women who had learned over the winter where each other's particular strengths landed. The space was a back room at the general store, whose owner owed Carl Patterson a favor and was happy to put it towards something useful. Margaret organized the practical logistics, the scheduling, the outreach to families who might benefit, the management of the fact that some people needed to be approached 3 times before they'd admit they needed help. Eliza ran the actual sessions. What she taught was not sophisticated. That was the point. She taught the basics of reading a loan agreement, the questions you had to ask before signing anything, the specific things to look for in payment receipts and how to compare them against lender statements. She taught people to keep copies of everything, to write down the name of whoever took their payment, to never consolidate their records with a creditor's office. She taught people to read both sides of the ledger simultaneously. The first session had 4 people in it. By the 3rd session, 9. By summer, she was running 2 sessions a week, and Rosa Castellano had taken over one of them for the families more comfortable conducting the conversation in Spanish, which freed Eliza to start corresponding with Margaret's contact in the next valley over, where a similar situation had apparently been developing for years under a different name but the same basic method. She wrote out there in June with a copy of the commission case file and Garrison's contact information and the particular efficiency of someone who has done this before and knows which steps can be skipped and which cannot. It was harder the second time in some ways. The families were more suspicious, the records more scattered, the situation complicated by a third party whose involvement wasn't immediately clear. She made mistakes she hadn't made the first time and caught them herself, which was its own education. She was gone for 3 weeks. When she came back, Silas was at the barn when she rode in, and he looked up and something in his face did the thing she'd noticed the first time and hadn't had language for yet. The thing that was about her specifically, not about what she'd accomplished or what she'd brought back. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Complicated," she said. "Better than I expected by the end. I'll tell you about it." "Dinner's made," he said. "You look like you haven't eaten since Tuesday." "Thursday," she said, which was nearly true. He took her horse without being asked, and she went inside where the kitchen was warm and the table was set, and the house had the quality of a place that has been maintained carefully in someone's absence. Not waiting, exactly, but continuing, which was better. She sat down. She was tired in a way that was clean rather than desperate. The tiredness of work that had been done rather than work that had outpaced her. When Silas came in from the barn, she told him about the second valley. All of it. The complications, the mistakes, the families, the specific moment when the pattern had revealed itself again under the different terminology like a word in a new language that turns out to mean the same thing. He listened the way he always listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually following. "How many families this time, Tiao?" he asked. 7 confirmed, probably 9 when the full picture comes in. "Same method?" "Close enough that Fowler's testimony may apply." She paused. "I've written to Garrison. He'll know whether the commission can extend the existing case or whether it needs to be filed separately." Silas ate in silence for a moment. "Margaret's going to want to know immediately," he said. "I'll talk to her tomorrow." "She's been running the office well," he said. "Had 8 people last Tuesday, apparently. She sent one of the Abbott boys to tell me very casually, as if she wasn't proud of it." Eliza felt the smile that came at that. Margaret Hargrove did not do casual. "She's good at it," Eliza said. "Better than she expected to be, I think." Silas looked at her across the table. "You gave her something to do with all that energy." "She gave herself something. I just suggested the direction." He looked at her for a moment. "You do that a lot," he said. "Give people credit for what you enabled." "Because it's accurate." It's also generous. It's accurate, she said again. There's a difference between understanding that a problem exists and being willing to do something about it. I can show people the numbers. I can't make them brave. He was quiet. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Just remembering something. What? 23 words, he said. I had 23 words and I was trying to find the one woman in the country who wouldn't flinch. He looked at her with the steady directness that was his best quality. I undersold what I was actually hoping for. She looked back at him. You found her anyway, she said. Outside, the spring dark was the kind that comes after a long season of cold, softer than winter dark, carrying the smell of turned earth and the sound of the creek running high with snowmelt. The ranch that had been described to her as nearly bankrupt sat in it, solvent and real, surrounded by a valley that had spent a winter learning to read its own numbers and had come out the other side changed in ways that would outlast the season. She thought about what she'd believed when she got off that train, that she was coming to manage a failing ranch, that she was making a practical choice, trading her skills for stability, setting aside the larger ambitions that Caldwell had made it clear were not available to her there. She hadn't understood then that practicality at its best doesn't limit you, that the most practical thing she'd ever done was arrive somewhere and simply tell the truth about what she saw in the numbers, and that the truth had been larger than anyone expected, including her. There is something worth saying about that, though the saying of it requires care, because lessons extracted from other people's suffering can become sentimental very fast, and sentiment is the enemy of the truth it claims to serve. What the East Valley learned that winter was not a complicated thing. It was this: the people most likely to be robbed are the ones who've been made to believe they can't read. Not illiterate, unable to read the specific language that controls their own financial lives. That language is not mysterious. It can be learned. And the person who teaches it doesn't need a title or a law degree or a letter of authority from anyone. They need to have been in the room when someone explained it, and to be willing to be in the room when someone else needs it explained. Eliza Whitmore had been in that room. Her father had put her there, probably without understanding fully what he was giving her. She had spent years in towns that looked at what she could do and found it inconvenient, and she had traveled west to marry a struggling rancher and arrived to find that the struggle was manufactured and the numbers were lying, and she was, by the specific accident of her own history, exactly the person who could see it. That is not a story about destiny. It is a story about what happens when someone who has been told their knowledge is worthless finds a place where it is urgently needed, and about what happens to a place when the person who arrives to help it refuses to look away from what's true. The East Valley of the territory would have more trouble. Other years, other pressures, other men with well-designed systems, and the patience to let them run. That was the nature of things. But it would go into those troubles knowing how to read its own ledgers. And it had, in the back room of a general store 2 days a week, a woman who would keep teaching until that knowledge was so widely held that a scheme like Harrow's couldn't survive long enough to become invisible. That was not a small thing. Eliza sat at the kitchen table of Birch Hollow Ranch, in the house she'd arrived at with one trunk and a set of questions, and finished her dinner and listened to the creek running outside, and thought about the second valley and the third session of the bookkeeping office and the letter she needed to write to Garrison, and whether the Castellano family's north pasture would be ready for the additional cattle they were planning for summer. Practical things. Real things. The kind that build a life day by day in the specific place where you have decided to stay.